Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, managing editor of Canada's Entrepreneur. Joining me today, Phil Soper, who is president and CEO of Royal LePage. Thanks for joining us again, Phil.
Pleasure.
Excellent new report, a recent report that you folks put out and I found interesting. 54% of renters plan to buy a house in the future. Now, first of all, uh, does that surprise you? Is that a high, low number, or a pretty decent number?
It's a little bit higher than I would have anticipated. Um, for a long time, we've had about two-thirds of Canadians owning their homes, and one-third are renters. We know that ownership is an aspirational thing for most families and most reach it if two-thirds of households get there. But for half of that remaining third, or I guess a little over half, to say they were they they were on the path to home ownership, yeah, it was a big number.
Now, you have that number, and that's the aspirational number.
Exactly.
What's the reality? Given the conditions in the economy and in the housing market these days, what's the reality for that 54% that want to buy a house?
Well, about a third, 32% of that 54% plan to buy in the next 2 years. So I'd say that number is something you could bank on because 2 years is a pretty short time frame. You'd have to have your down payment in order, have talked to your bank, etc. Been tracking home prices. Another group that brings the number up to close to half, say within five. So I'd say that 2 to 5 year group, there'll be some fallout from that group. But do I expect the home ownership rate in Canada to change materially from that two-thirds? No. But there is shifts, right? You get older people moving out of home ownership into some kind of rental equation. And of course, people pass on. And the way we keep that high level of home ownership in Canada, not the highest in the world, but among, is that new people are moving from rent to buy.
Okay, I'm curious of what you just said. Like, where
Yeah.
are we on the world scale for the percentage of people in a population that owns a home?
You know, we're I've looked and done some research, like World Bank looks at it, and they're oddities in the numbers. Like there's certain countries in places you wouldn't expect it, like in Southeast Asia, where the homeownership rate is quite high. And it's when you dig into it, it's because it's directly government supported. And then at the other extreme, I'm sure you've heard of the Case Shiller Index in the United
Yep.
States. Dr. Schiller, a Nobel laureate, I did a television program with him. Goes back a few years to the American financial crisis. And he had done a study into Switzerland and home ownership. And the home ownership rate there is quite low, only about 25%. And in Switzerland, this stalwart of banking and such, they don't equate home ownership to citizenship. Whereas in Canada and the United States, for example, owning a piece of the rock, owning part of the land, I think dates back to when we were fleeing the feudal systems in Europe generations ago, and people saw a chance to own. And that's still true with today's immigrants. Many of the immigrants from Southeast Asia, from Philippines, were renters in their big cities, and they come to Canada and they see the opportunity to be owners, to actually own their home, something that always was, beyond their reach. And here it's not. So, yeah, it's public policy. CMHC was formed after the Second World War as a way for people to own their own properties. The governments back then, call it 100 years ago, decided it was good for the country for people to be owners, and I think the stats prove that it is.
Okay. So, when we look at renters, there's no surprise that rents over the last few years have gone up quite significantly, although they're kind of stabilized and going down at the point. But how much is the high level of rent payments contributing to the fact that someone sitting there going, "Hey, I should buy a home instead"?
Definitely, it rents tend to be a little bit of a lagging indicator of property values. So we've seen in our biggest cities, Vancouver, Toronto really is at the heart of it. Prices soften over the last 40 months and rents have followed, particularly rents in the condo sector in the Greater Toronto and the lower mainland of BC. But it's been slower coming. But home prices and the cost of borrowing have come down significantly. And people's incomes, interestingly, I was looking at the most recent data. Nationally, incomes were up 4.3% year over year last month. So incomes are still rising at a quicker rate than probably the Bank of Canada would like. This is a post-pandemic labor shortage issue. But when you step back, you say borrowing's dropping, home prices are flat or dropping in many neighborhoods, and incomes are rising. That just makes people say, "I wonder, is that door open? Is now the time to make a move?" But I will say, and it's important for your viewers to understand this, owning is more expensive on a monthly basis because you're paying both for the consumption of shelter,
Yeah.
i.e., rent equivalents, and you're doing like an RSP. You're investing in something. So, from a pure cash flow basis, you're not going to be actually paying less each month,
Yeah.
but call it half of what you're paying is going into your future.
So I'm curious, you rewind the clock a few years back, and the entry level for someone to come into home ownership is usually a single family home, like a bungalow or whatever, right? And I'm wondering if that in time has shifted, and that the entry level now has become like the condo or an attached home for most people.
It really depends where you live. So if you go to Saskatoon, there are a higher percentage of first-time homeowners who are buying a detached home.
Mm.
If you're in the city of Toronto, the dominant first home is a condominium, maybe a townhouse style condominium, but that is what most people get their foot on the property ladder. When we ask people, this is interesting, when we ask people from coast to coast where they want to live, most people still say detached homes,
Yeah.
even if public policy is hoping that more people will live in what we in the industry would call multis because it's easier on the environment and transportation infrastructure and such. But they still have that white picket fence dream.
Yeah. And last question for you, like,
Sure.
have the dream to want to buy a home and be a homeowner, but in reality, what's the supply like for people who are looking and will be looking?
It's we're in an interesting time. Very different than say the end of, because I do feel like it's the end of a correction period when the market's slower than normal. If we think of the correction that happened in 2020, at the end of 2020, when when that pandemic downturn got released and the market started growing again, we had very few homes. You could say the same in 2015.
Mm.
There was that correction in the early teens, and coming into 2015, the market heated up, but inventory was very constrained. This time, because of this elongated period of correction post pandemic, inventory levels are healthy in almost all markets. There are exceptions. Quebec City, to a certain degree, Montreal are inventory constrained. Calgary was, but it's gotten much better over the past year. So the good news here is when the market does kick into gear again, and we had a strong end of May and in our internal systems, the first 2 weeks of June were quite a bit stronger than we experienced in the spring. Um, we've got the inventory to satisfy that demand, and it won't shoot prices up, which sometimes happens in Canada. You get that slingshot roller coaster up and down, and I think we'll avoid double-digit home price increases.
Okay, super. Thanks so much, Phil, for joining us.
My pleasure as always.
Okay, that was Phil Soper, President and CEO of Royal LePage. I'm Mario Toneguzzi, Managing Editor of Canada's Entrepreneur. Thanks for joining us today.